The Concord of Worlds had existed for 600 years before humanity learned it was there. That number matters. 6 centuries of interstellar diplomacy, trade routes carved through the dark between 43 species, a shared legal framework governing everything from territorial rights to the rights of sapient beings to exist without interference. 600 years of careful, incremental civilization building, and humanity had spent most of that time arguing about oil pipelines and whether a particular shade of blue on a national flag was offensive. We were late to the party. Everyone knew it, including us. The first contact event, the real one, not the grainy telescope footage and radio signals that had been debated for decades, happened in 2041, when a Caliph survey drone malfunctioned in the outer belt of the solar system and broadcast a distress signal in 17 frequencies simultaneously. The crew of the ISS Endeavour 3, then on a routine maintenance rotation, intercepted it. Engineer Maya Castillo later said it sounded like someone singing a very sad song in a language she'd never heard, but somehow understood the emotion of perfectly. Humanity's response, characteristically, was both completely chaotic and surprisingly functional. Within 48 hours, a joint emergency session of the UN Security Council was broadcasting a reply in every frequency they could manage. Within 6 months, the first formal translation framework had been established. Within 3 years, humanity had a seat, technically an observer seat with limited speaking rights, at the lowest tier of Concord diplomatic proceedings. We were the newest species, the youngest, the smallest in terms of space we occupied. Our single inhabited world and a handful of barely functional off-world colonies were a statistical footnote compared to species who had been traveling between star systems for longer than our civilization had existed. The Caliph, who had accidentally sparked the whole thing, were apologetic in the formal multi-layered way their culture required. The Vreth, who functioned as something like the Concord's administrative backbone, were cautious and procedural in their assessment of us. The Davan, the oldest spacefaring species still actively present in galactic politics, simply watched. They had seen many young species earn their seats. Most of them, over the long centuries, had eventually faded. But there was one species that had not initially been interested in caution or procedure. The Sorith Dominion did not have a seat at the Concord. They operated outside it, had refused every overture toward membership for 200 years, and had spent that time building the most systematically aggressive expansion program that the Concord had ever documented. Not aggressive in an emotional sense. The Sorith were not impulsive. They were architects. They identified resource-rich systems, cataloged any species present, assessed military response capability, and then made a calculation. If the calculation favored them, they moved. 14 species had lost sovereign territory to the Sorith in the past century and a half. 3 had lost everything. The Concord had issued formal condemnations, sanctions, and strongly worded diplomatic communications. The Sorith had filed them appropriately and continued. Humanity learned all of this slowly, through translated documents and careful diplomatic briefings, while we were still trying to figure out how our own observer seat worked. It was alarming, certainly. But the Sorith's current expansion vectors were moving away from human space, toward a cluster of contested systems near the galactic rim. It was, for us, a distant problem. Terrible but distant. That changed in 2057. The UNSV Kestrel was not a warship by any traditional definition. She was classified under the Unified Nations Space Force Charter as an enhanced survey vessel, a designation that existed somewhere between scientific research and military reconnaissance, specifically created because humanity had been advised by multiple Concord members that deploying overtly military vessels in interstellar space would be diplomatically inadvisable at our current stage of membership. It was a compromise. Most important things are. The Kestrel was 340 meters long, a respectable size by human standards, modest by the scale of Concord fleet doctrine. She carried a crew of 190 personnel drawn from 12 nations. She was armed, lightly, formally, with a defensive weapons package that had been carefully reviewed by Concord observers and declared acceptable for a vessel of her classification. She carried the most sophisticated sensor array humanity had ever put into space. She was fast. Not the fastest thing in explored space, but faster than most Concord members expected something our size to be. Her mission, officially, was boundary survey, mapping the edge of the territory that the Concord had informally designated as humanity's zone of interest, establishing formal coordinates for the eventual submission of our territorial claims. Procedural. Routine. Exactly the kind of mission that a young species was supposed to be running while the adults handled the more complicated problems. Commander Yusuf Adaora had commanded the Kestrel for 4 years. He was 47, Nigerian-born, a career UNSF officer with a background in deep space navigation and a reputation for making sound decisions under pressure. He had been selected for this mission specifically because the psychological assessment had described him as temperamentally unsuited to escalation. He was not, in the language of the assessment, the kind of man who looked for fights. What he was the kind of man who finished them. On March 14, 2057, while conducting scheduled boundary mapping in the crevasse sector, a loose designation for a sparse region of interstellar space approximately 2.3 light-years from the nearest documented Sorith territory, the Kestrel's long-range sensors identified something that should not have been there. A Sorith forward installation. Not a ship. An installation. Prefabricated, modular, the kind of structure that the Sorith deployed in the early stages of a new territorial claim. Sensor arrays, communication relays, fuel processing equipment. Small crew, maybe 40 or 50 personnel. Automated defense systems. And it was inside the coordinates that the Concorde had, 6 months earlier, formally logged as the outer boundary of human-designated survey space. Lieutenant Commander Priya Vasanth, the Kestrel's first officer, pulled up the documentation 3 times to be certain. She was, by all accounts, extraordinarily thorough. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying the specific flatness of someone who has just confirmed something alarming, "this is inside our zone." Adaora looked at the sensor returns for a long moment. "How long has it been there?" "Construction signatures suggest 40 to 60 days. He nodded slowly. "Give me a full scan. Everything we can collect without active emissions." He paused. "And get Concorde Command on the long-range relay. We'll need them to know about this." "And if they don't respond in time?" Adaora turned back to the display. The installation sat there in the sensor feed, small and precise and entirely deliberate. The Sorith did nothing accidentally. "Then," he said, "we'll handle it ourselves." Across the Concorde's diplomatic networks, the Sorith had just done something they had never done to any species still holding an active membership seat. They had crossed a line without first checking whether anyone on the other side of it was watching. They hadn't checked because they hadn't needed to. Not yet. The galaxy had made an assumption about humanity. It was about to be tested. There is a particular kind of discipline that comes from knowing you are outmatched in raw numbers but not in clarity. Commander Adaora had spent a long time thinking about what that discipline looked like in practice. Not as an abstract concept, as a doctrine. Because the UNSF had understood from nearly the beginning of their Concorde membership that humanity was not going to win any confrontation in explored space through force of arms alone. Not yet. Not for a generation, maybe 2. The fleet we had was capable, well-trained, genuinely competitive at the individual vessel level. But the Sorith Dominion had over 400 warships of destroyer class or larger. Humanity had 23. So doctrine had evolved accordingly, shaped by strategists who had studied every conflict in Concorde historical records and drawn a consistent conclusion. The species that won were rarely the ones who fired first. They were the ones who framed the confrontation. Who established the narrative before the shooting started. Who made the other party look like the aggressor in front of witnesses who had long memories and longer institutional patience. The Kestrel's mission profile had a section labeled Protocol 7, written specifically for situations where a vessel encountered potential Sorith territorial encroachment. It ran to 47 pages. Adaora had read it until he could recite sections from memory. Step 1 was always, document everything. For the next 6 hours the Kestrel ran silent. Not hiding. The Sorith installation certainly knew something was in the region. Any installation worth operating would have passive sensor sweeps running continuously. But Kestrel stayed outside active detection range, using only passive systems, building a sensor picture of the installation that was, by the time Vasanth declared it complete, the most detailed external survey of a Sorith military structure that humanity had ever assembled. Dimensions precise to the meter. Power output signatures. Communication frequencies. The orbital pattern of 2 small automated defense drones, Thorns the Sorith called them, that made lazy circuits around the installation's perimeter. The heat signatures that suggested how many personnel were inside and roughly where they were positioned. All of it logged, time-stamped, cross-referenced against the official Concorde survey coordinates that formally designated this space as human territory. Specialist Tomoko Abe, the Kestrel signals officer, had been raised by a father who was a maritime lawyer. She had grown up listening to arguments about documentation and jurisdictional precedent at the dinner table. When she finished preparing the evidentiary package, because that was what it was, every byte of sensor data organized into a format that Concorde legal proceedings could admit, she looked at it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood exactly what it would do. "This is going to hurt them," she said to no one in particular. "That's the intent," Vasanth replied. The Concord's communication relay network was, by human standards, miraculous. By Concord standards, it was aging infrastructure that needed replacement. Either way it worked. Adora's priority message reached the Concord's Central Diplomatic Bureau on Vreth Prime in approximately 11 hours. A delay imposed by the physics of the relay system, not the urgency of the transmission. The message was precise. 412 words, composed by Adora personally, reviewed by Vasanth and the Kestrel's senior staff. It stated the facts without embellishment. The coordinates, the installation, the timeline, the documentation package attached. It formally invoked humanity's observer member rights under Concord Charter Section 7, Article 14, the article covering territorial violation of member-recognized zones. It requested an emergency session of the Concord Boundary Arbitration Committee. It did not threaten. It did not speculate about intentions. It did not ask for protection. It simply said with quiet precision, "This happened, here is the proof, we are invoking the process." The Vreth diplomatic officer who received and processed the message, a senior attaché named Vessel Administrator Korath, who had been handling human diplomatic communications since the early observer days, read it twice, then immediately flagged it for urgent escalation. In a message to his superior, he wrote something that would later become something of a famous line in Concord diplomatic history. "The humans are not asking us to solve this. They are asking us to witness it." The Sorath became aware that the Kestrel was present approximately 4 hours after the documentation phase was complete. It happened in a way that was almost mundane. One of the Thorn drones, completing its patrol circuit, swept slightly wider than its standard pattern and brought the Kestrel within the edge of its active sensor range. There was a pause of roughly 30 seconds as the installation processed the contact. Then a tightly focused communication beam, aimed directly at the Kestrel, in the standard Concord Universal Protocol. The message, translated, was brief and carried the specific tone of Sorath official communication. Flat, declarative, carrying the implicit assumption of authority, unidentified vessel. You are in proximity to a Sorath Dominion active asset. Identify your classification and withdraw to a distance of no less than 50 light minutes within the next 6 hours. Adora read it standing at the communications console. Around the bridge, 17 people were very carefully not looking directly at him while absolutely paying attention to what he was going to do. He dictated his response without sitting down. Sorath installation, this is Commander Yusuf Adora, UNSV Kestrel, operating under Charter of the Unified Nations Space Force, Earth, Concord Observer Member. You are advised that your installation is positioned within coordinates formally registered with the Concord Boundary Surveying Authority as Human Designated Survey Space. Reference filing number HB 2056-441. A full documentation package of your installation has been transmitted to the Concord Central Diplomatic Bureau under emergency priority. We are not withdrawing. We are observing. We will continue to observe until the Concord arbitration process reaches its conclusion. He paused, then added one line that was not in any protocol document. It came from somewhere older than doctrine. We have nowhere else to be. The installation did not respond for 2 hours. When it did, the message was not addressed to the Kestrel. It was on a separate frequency, the Soratha's own long-range communication band, encrypted but not beyond the Kestrel's signal's capacity to detect and log, though not immediately decode. Abe flagged it, recorded it, and added it to the evidentiary package. Whatever the Sorath installation was reporting back to its command structure, it had felt the need to report it. Inside the Concord diplomatic networks, the Kestrel's filing was already moving. The Vreth administrators, to their institutional credit, were efficient. An emergency session of the Boundary Arbitration Committee was convened within 18 hours of Adora's message arriving, a speed that was, by Concord bureaucratic standards, practically instantaneous. The Caliph ambassador, who had maintained a cautiously warm relationship with human diplomats since the first contact event, made a public statement of support for the process. The Davan, characteristically, said nothing and sent observers. 11 other Concord member species filed formal notices of concern. 2 smaller species, who had both lost territory to the Sorath in previous decades, filed amicus briefs. The Sorath ambassador, in the brief statement his government released, called the human filing procedurally irregular and noted that the Sorath Dominion did not recognize the authority of the Concord to adjudicate territorial questions outside formal membership status. It was their standard response. They had used it before. It had worked before because the species they'd used it against had either backed down or lacked the standing to press the case. But those species hadn't been sitting on 6 hours of sensor data that showed exactly what the installation was and exactly where it sat relative to formally registered coordinates. And they hadn't had a crew of 190 people still parked 300,000 kilometers away, still watching, still logging. Ada Ora received a message from the UN Secretary-General that evening. It was short: "You're doing exactly right." Hold. He hadn't planned to do anything else. Outside the Kestrel's viewport, the stars were very still and very cold, and the Sorith installation's running lights made a small, steady pulse in the dark, the heartbeat of something that had not yet realized it was being outmaneuvered not by weapons, but by patience. The Sorith had built empires on the assumption that witnesses didn't matter. They were about to learn that one ship with a full sensor log and a crew that knew its rights could be more dangerous than a fleet. The Concord Boundary Arbitration Committee had never moved quickly. That was not a flaw in the system, it was a feature. 43 species with different neurological processing speeds, different concepts of urgency, different cultural frameworks for what constituted an emergency meant that the Concord's deliberative bodies had been deliberately designed to be slow and thorough. Fast decisions, in 600 years of experience, tended to create more conflicts than they resolved. But there were exceptions. And the exceptions had a common thread. They occurred when the evidence was so clean, so clearly documented, so structurally unambiguous, that the usual procedural friction had nothing to grip. The Kestrel's package gave the tribunal nothing to debate except conclusions. Arbitration sessions were conducted in a virtual space, a deliberate architectural choice made early in the Concord's history, because no physical location could be both neutral and accessible to all member species. Each delegation was represented by a presence built from their world's preferred symbolic language, filtered through a shared translation framework. The Vreth appeared as structured geometric forms. The Caliph as soft-edged luminous shapes. The Davin, in their ancient and particular way, appeared as a single point of deep blue light that nevertheless managed to convey the impression of a very large, very patient entity paying close attention. Humanity's delegation was 3 people sitting at a plain rectangular table, because the human diplomatic team had gone back and forth on symbolic representation for 2 years and finally decided that the only honest choice was to look like what they were. Ambassador Chidinma Okafor was 61. A former professor of international law who had been humanity's senior Concord representative for 4 years. She had the specific quality of stillness that comes from spending decades in rooms where the stakes were high and the talking was careful. She had read the Kestrel's documentation package 11 times on the transit to the hearing. She knew it the way a surgeon knows an anatomy diagram, every layer, every implication, every place where someone might try to find ambiguity. There wasn't much ambiguity to find. The Sorith Dominion's representation at the tribunal was handled by a senior envoy named Doctrine Speaker Auric, not an ambassador in the traditional sense, because the Sorith did not maintain ambassadors at institutions they did not recognize as having authority over them. Auric's title was a Sorith legal military designation that translated roughly to the one who explains our position to those who require explaining. He was by all accounts very good at it. He was also this time working with a difficult brief. The session opened with the presentation of the human filing. Okafor walked the tribunal through it without theatrical emphasis. The coordinates, the registration dates, the sensor data, the timeline. She used the Kestrel's own visual reconstructions, built from passive sensor data, to show the installation's position relative to the boundary markers. The gap between the installation center coordinates and the registered boundary line was 0.003 light-years. Small in cosmic terms. Legally, in Concord framework terms, irrelevant. Inside was inside. The Vreth arbitration chair, a senior administrative figure named Protocol Keeper Savanthi, whose career had spanned 40 years of boundary disputes, studied the data for a long time before speaking. When she did, her translated voice was careful and neutral. The documentation is consistent. The coordinates are registered. The timeline shows the installation was constructed after the registration was complete. Pause. Doctrine Speaker Auric, the Sorith Dominion has an opportunity to respond to these specifics. Auric had a long, deliberate way of speaking that was not designed to convey information so much as weight. He acknowledged the documentation. He noted that the Sorith did not recognize the human boundary registration as creating a legal obligation on non-member entities. He cited 2 previous cases in which the Sorith had made similar arguments and the Concord had declined to pursue enforcement action. He was technically accurate about both cases. What he didn't note, and what Okafor was waiting for him to not note, was that in both of those previous cases, the affected species had been observer members with limited standing. Humanity had been an observer member too, but 6 months before the Kestrel filed its report, Earth's diplomatic team had quietly finalized and submitted a formal application for associate membership, the tier above observer, which carried expanded legal standing under Section 7. The application had been pending. The tribunal's convening, under the emergency provisions Eta Ora had invoked, had automatically triggered a provisional elevation of standing for the duration of the proceedings. Auric had almost certainly known this. He was too careful not to have. But he'd calculated that the tribunal wouldn't want to set the precedent of granting provisional standing, that it would be too disruptive to existing frameworks. He had miscalculated. Protocol keeper Savanthi announced the provisional standing decision in the same measured tone she used for everything. There was a pause in the virtual space that was, for those who knew how to read it, extremely significant. The Davin's blue point of light pulsed once, slowly. Auric requested a recess. 47 minutes later, he returned with a modified position. The installation had been placed in error, he said. A surveying discrepancy. The Sorith Dominion acknowledged that the coordinates fell within the registered human zone. They were prepared to commence a withdrawal timeline of no less than 90 Concord Standard Days, which was, he noted, entirely consistent with the procedures for resolving construction errors under Concord Charter. It was a face-saving exit. The Sorith were offering to leave but framing it as a procedural correction, not a retreat. Okafor had expected this. She had discussed it with the UN Security Council's Space Affairs Subcommittee at 3 a.m. the previous night, Earth time. She declined to accept the 90-day timeline. She cited Section 7, Article 14, Subsection 4, which in cases of established territorial violation allowed the affected party to request an expedited withdrawal, not to exceed 30 days, when the violation was clearly documented and undisputed. Auric said that timeline was not practical given the installation's operational state. Okafor said she was prepared to let the tribunal set the timeline if the parties couldn't agree. The tribunal set 22 days. It was the first time in Concord history that a non-full member species had successfully invoked Section 7 against the Sorith Dominion. The session's transcripts were distributed through standard Concord channels within hours. The response was not loud. The Concord was not an institution that did loud. But 14 separate member species filed formal acknowledgments of the tribunal's findings. 3 species that had previously lost territory to the Sorith filed new retrospective claims, citing the precedent. The Caliph ambassador issued a carefully phrased statement that concluded with something that translated, approximately, as, "The young species handled this well." The Davin said nothing publicly. But a Davin senior observer who had been watching human diplomatic proceedings for 3 years sent a private message to Okafor that consisted of 3 words in Concord Common Language, which translated as, "Noted, with interest." From the Davin, that was essentially a standing ovation. On the Kestrel, Eta Ora received the tribunal results while eating breakfast. Vasanth read them aloud from a summary. He listened, finished his coffee and said nothing for a moment. 22 days, he finally said. "Yes, sir." "Are they going to honor it?" Vasanth's expression suggested she had spent time thinking about this. The Sorith have been inside the Concord framework for 200 years without joining it. They've used the process when it suited them and ignored it when it didn't. This is the first time the process has been used against them successfully. She paused. They'll honor it. Not because they want to, because if they don't, every species that's been waiting for a crack in that armor will use this precedent to file everything they have. Eta Ora nodded. "We built them a trap and put the door open." "We just showed them the door," Vasanth said. "They built the trap themselves over the last 2 centuries. Outside, the installation still sat in the dark, its lights still pulsing. But there were already faint thermal signatures that suggested power-down sequences had begun in non-essential systems. Day 1 of 22. In 600 years of Concord history, no non-member force had ever made the Sorith Dominion retreat. Humanity had done it with a survey ship, a sensor array and a 47-page protocol document. The galaxy was beginning to pay a different kind of attention. The Sorith did not make the same mistake twice. That was the thing about them, the thing that made them genuinely dangerous in a way that went beyond raw military capacity. They were not impulsive. They did not escalate out of anger. When they were checked, they studied the situation with the same methodical patience they applied to everything else, identified the mechanism that had produced the setback, and then engineered a solution that removed that mechanism. In the months following the tribunal's decision and the installation's withdrawal, completed on day 19 of 22, with a precision that was itself a statement, the Sorith were quiet. Conspicuously quiet. In Concord diplomatic circles, this was noted and discussed. Most of the analysis concluded that the Dominion was absorbing the precedent, recalculating its approach to the outer expansion vectors, perhaps reconsidering the wisdom of continued pressure toward the galactic rim where human-registered space now sat as an officially recognized barrier. Commander Adaora had submitted his mission report, returned the Kestrel to the UNSF's primary operating base at Luna Station, and been given 3 months of administrative leave that he spent largely attending meetings in which officials wanted to ask him about the experience, and he tried to explain that it had mostly been about sensor logs and patience. He received a commendation. The Kestrel's crew received a unit citation. There were some ceremonies. He thought about Sorath quiet for most of those 3 months. The second event began not in human space but in the Hellion Corridor, a loose chain of systems that sat between the Sorath's established eastern expansion zone and the edge of the space that humanity had registered. The Hellion systems were technically unclaimed, a buffer zone that had existed by informal convention for decades. Nobody owned them. Nobody wanted to own them because they were resource-poor and navigationally inconvenient. Unless you were building a staging position. The Concord's deep space monitoring network, old infrastructure, maintained primarily by Vreth administrative budget, increasingly unreliable at its outer edges, flagged anomalous transit signatures in the Hellion Corridor in Month 7 post-tribunal. Not an installation this time. Ships. Multiple contacts, moving in coordinated patterns consistent with fleet doctrine, staying carefully outside any registered boundary. Legal. Technically completely legal. The UNSF intelligence assessment, delivered to the Security Council in a closed session that Adaora attended as a subject matter advisor, was careful in its language and clear in its conclusion. The Sorath were positioning a force. Not for immediate action. The force concentration was still too dispersed, too far from any logical attack vector. But it was the preparatory phase of something. The Intelligence Directorate used the phrase deliberate capacity demonstration, a military posture designed to convey to an opponent that escalation was available, at a time of the Sorath's choosing. It was, in the language of Earth military history, gunboat diplomacy. The difference was that this particular gunboat fleet was composed of approximately 60 warships. Humanity's response was developed over 3 weeks of intensive planning involving the UNSF High Command, the UN Security Council, the Concord diplomatic delegation, and because at this stage the situation warranted it, direct consultation with the Caliph and Vreth governments, both of which had been informed through diplomatic channels. The response had 3 components because single-vector responses to complex situations were how you got outmaneuvered. The first component was transparent. Humanity formally notified the Concord of the force concentration, filed it as a matter of record under the same Section 7 provisions that had proven effective before, and requested that the Concord's monitoring infrastructure expand its survey coverage of the Hellion Corridor. This was not a claim of illegality. The Sorath ships were in unclaimed space and had every right to be there. It was simply documentation. Pattern building. Creating a record. The second component was diplomatic. Okafor's team initiated quiet consultations with the 7 Concord member species who had previously lost territory to the Sorath, proposing a framework for a collective monitoring agreement, a shared early warning network that would pool sensor data from multiple species assets to provide coverage that no single observer could maintain alone. It was framed as a general initiative for boundary security, not specifically directed at the Sorath. 5 species agreed within 2 weeks. 2 more followed within a month. The third component was the one that required the most difficult decisions. The UNSF's Accelerated Fleet Development Program had been running since 2043, initially as a modest initiative, then progressively expanded as humanity's understanding of the galactic situation deepened. By 2058, the force that had existed at the time of the Kestrel incident, 23 vessels of destroyer class or larger, had grown to 41. Not 60. Not 400. But 41 ships crewed by people who had spent 15 years developing doctrine specifically for asymmetric conflict with technologically comparable opponents in a legal political framework where legitimacy mattered as much as firepower. Admiral Fatima al-Rashid, the UNSF's commander of operations, had a phrase she used in training scenarios. We don't need to win every engagement. We need to make winning expensive. It had evolved from a study of Earth guerrilla conflicts, adapted through careful analysis of every recorded military confrontation in Concord historical archives, refined into a doctrine that the UNSF called contested deterrence. The principle was straightforward. You didn't need parity to deter. You needed to credibly threaten costs that outweighed gains. If the Sorath moved on human space and achieved their objective, what would they have gained? Resource-poor systems, a mid-tier inhabited world with a population of 12 billion that would require occupation resources, and a Concord precedent crisis that would energize every species that had been quietly nursing territorial grievances. The calculus had to be made to not favor them. 3 UNSF patrol groups, 9 vessels each, were repositioned toward the inner boundary of human-registered space, close enough to the Hellion corridor to be a clear signal but not close enough to constitute a threat to Sorath vessels in unclaimed territory. Their movements were filed transparently with the Concord Monitoring Authority. They conducted training exercises in full view of Concord observer drones. The message was not "we will destroy you." The message was, "We are here, we are watching, and we are not bluffing about what comes next." The Sorath made their own calculation. It took longer than anyone expected. 4 months of continued fleet positioning, occasional probe maneuvers toward the corridor's inner edge, a sustained pattern of pressure that kept the UNSF's patrol groups at elevated readiness and tested the collective monitoring network that Okafor had spent weeks building. And then, gradually, the concentration began to disperse. Not all at once, that would have been too clean, too obviously a retreat. Over 6 weeks, the fleet signatures in the corridor thinned. Ships moved to other sectors. The pattern of transit activity shifted back toward the Soratha's established interior zones. The monitoring network logged all of it. In a closed Concord session, the Vreth protocol keeper noted, with the measured understatement of someone making an observation they found genuinely surprising, "The human response framework appears to have achieved deterrent effect without kinetic engagement." The Caliph ambassador, less formally, sent Okafor's delegation a message that included a cultural expression roughly equivalent to, "We did not expect that." Adaora was back on the Kestrel by then, given a new mission profile and a larger crew allocation. He heard the news through official channels, read the assessments, and thought for a long time about what it meant. The Sorath hadn't been stopped by force. They'd been stopped by the recognition that the cost-benefit calculation had shifted. That this particular young species had, in a short time and with limited resources, built enough legal credibility, enough coalition relationships, and enough credible military presence that moving against them was no longer a clean operation. It was more complicated than that, and he knew it. This wasn't over. The Sorath were patient, and patient problems didn't disappear. They adapted. But for now the corridor was quiet. He made a note in his captain's log. "The galaxy seems to have updated its assessment of us. We should be careful not to let it become complacency." 60 Sorath warships had not been enough to make humanity flinch. What the Dominion did next would require a different kind of strategy entirely, one that humanity had never had to defend against before. The Sorath had a doctrine for situations like this. It was old, older than their space program, rooted in the same pre-spaceflight political traditions that had shaped every aspect of their expansion methodology. They called it, in their own language, something that translated approximately as softening the stone, the systematic process of undermining an opponent's structural supports before applying direct pressure. Not sabotage in the crude sense. Not espionage in the dramatic sense. Something more methodical and, in many ways, more dangerous. They looked for fracture lines. Every coalition has them. Every alliance between species with different histories, different survival instincts, and different assessments of acceptable risk carries internal stresses that are invisible in stable times and become visible under pressure. The Sorath had spent 2 centuries studying how Concord members interacted with each other, cataloging disagreements, mapping old grievances, identifying the relationships that looked strong but rested on narrow shared interests that could shift. When the direct pressure in the Hellion corridor had been met with a coherent human-coordinated response, the Soratha's strategic assessment had adjusted. The collective monitoring network that Okafor had built was more robust than they'd expected. The individual member species involved were small, yes, but their combined sensor coverage represented a real obstacle to the kind of opaque forward positioning the Sorath preferred. The solution was to make the coalition unstable. The first sign came from the Polhari, one of the 5 original signatories to the monitoring agreement. The Polhari were a modest spacefaring species, 1 inhabited world, a small fleet, a history of cautious diplomacy born from their unfortunate position between 2 larger powers over their first century of space travel. They had joined the monitoring agreement because it offered real security value at low cost. Their relationship with human diplomats was cordial, professionally warm, built on specific shared interests. In month 3 following the corridor de-escalation, the Polhari government quietly contacted the Concord's Administrative Bureau and filed an amendment to their monitoring agreement participation terms, reducing their sensor data sharing to a subset of their coverage, citing internal security protocols. No formal withdrawal. No dramatic gesture. Just a quiet reduction in contribution. Okafor's team flagged it immediately. The Vreth Administrative Bureau noted it. It was filed, logged, and analyzed. The analysis was inconclusive. Pulhari internal security protocols were a legitimate consideration. The change could be exactly what it appeared to be. But the timing was noted, and a discreet diplomatic inquiry was opened. The inquiry found nothing conclusive, which was itself a data point. Adaora was not directly involved in the coalition management. That was Okafor's domain, and she was better at it than he would have been. But he was involved in the consequence. Because when the Pulhari sensor coverage reduced, there was a gap in the monitoring network that covered approximately 0.4 light-years of the corridor's southern approach, and filling that gap required repositioning one of the Kestrel sister ships, the UNSV Marchetti, from a survey mission to a monitoring station role. The Marchetti's commanding officer, Commander Esperanza Villanueva, was good. Her crew was good. But a survey vessel doing a monitoring station's job was a compromise, and compromises created inefficiencies, and inefficiencies were where things slipped. Adaora wrote in his log, "The Sorith may be operating at a level of abstraction we haven't fully accounted for. We've been thinking about this as a military problem. It's a systems problem." He copied the log entry to the UNSF Intelligence Directorate with a flag for review. The second sign was different in character but consistent in implication. A Concord information channel, one of the distributed news and analysis networks that served diplomatic communities across member species, began circulating analysis pieces questioning the Human Monitoring Initiative. The pieces were not attributed to the Sorith. They were attributed to independent analysts from 3 different species, raising reasonable-sounding concerns. Was the collective monitoring agreement creating a precedent for militarized coalition behavior? Was humanity, as a new associate member, moving too aggressively toward a leadership role in Concord security affairs that it hadn't yet earned through established trust? The arguments were not unreasonable. They could have been written by genuine skeptics. Some of them probably were. But the pattern of where they appeared, when they appeared, and which specific relationships they targeted was analyzed by the UNSF intelligence team using a methodology borrowed from Earth's own experience with information operations. And the assessment was coordinated, low-confidence attribution, possible Sorith origin or amplification. Possible. Not certain. That was the nature of this kind of operation. Plausible deniability was the point. Okafor handled it the way she handled most things. Carefully, patiently, and by addressing the substance of the arguments rather than attempting to identify and attack their source. She gave a formal presentation to the Concord diplomatic community on humanity's legal framework for the monitoring initiative, its voluntary nature, and the explicit provisions that allowed any member to exit the agreement without penalty. She invited scrutiny. She published the agreement's full terms. 3 of the species that had been wavering recommitted to full participation after the presentation. The Pulhari did not, but they also did not withdraw further. The third sign was the one that required a response beyond diplomacy. The UNSF monitoring network detected a new pattern of probe activity, not fleet movements this time, but small, fast single-ship contacts moving through the southern corridor gap in trajectories consistent with reconnaissance. Fully legal. Unclaimed space. But the probes were passing close enough to the edge of human-registered territory that their sensor sweeps, if capable enough, would be collecting detailed information about the Marchetti's positioning and the human patrol group's patrol rhythms. They were being mapped. Not for an immediate attack. The force concentration in the corridor was still dispersed. But for the next time. Admiral al-Rashid convened a planning session that ran for 6 hours. The output was a decision that was, in some ways, the most significant strategic choice humanity had made since the tribunal. They would not react by trying to close the southern gap with additional military repositioning. That was the expected response. Moving assets to cover one gap would create others. Instead, they would make the mapping useless. The UNSF issued a new operations directive that introduced randomization protocols across all patrol group movements, controlled unpredictability, built around genuine operational variation rather than fixed patterns that could be mapped and exploited. They also, in a decision that required considerable bureaucratic negotiation, shared the randomization framework methodology, not their specific implementations but the underlying approach, with the Vreth and Caliph, who adopted versions of it for their own assets. The probe activity continued. But the data it was collecting was now systematically less useful. Specialist Abe, still aboard the Kestrel, had a saying she'd developed over the previous 2 years. The Sorith are very smart. The challenge is that we know they're very smart, which means we're already thinking about what they're going to do. The implication being that there was an asymmetry in the information war. The Soreth were reasoning about an opponent they'd underestimated at the start and were still building an accurate model of. Humanity was reasoning about an opponent it had studied obsessively from the day first contact was established. It wasn't an advantage in raw capability, but it was an advantage in cognitive readiness. The UNSF had a standing analytical unit, 12 people mixed military and civilian, based at Luna Station, whose entire function was to model Soreth decision-making. They had been running for 3 years. Their last major assessment, issued in the week following the corridor de-escalation, had predicted with reasonable accuracy the coalition targeting approach that followed. It had also flagged a concern that was as yet unconfirmed, that the current phase of Soreth activity, the probe mapping, the coalition softening, the information operation, was preparatory in nature. That the Soreth were not trying to win a tactical engagement. They were building a picture of humanity's response architecture with enough fidelity to identify, eventually, a moment when the constellation of factors favored a decisive move. Aotearoa read the assessment twice. He agreed with it. He also thought it contained an implicit reassurance that wasn't quite warranted. The analysis treated this as a chess match with comprehensible rules. He wasn't sure the rules were fully comprehensible yet. He wasn't sure they weren't. He thought about it the way he thought about most things. Methodically, without drama, with the specific alertness of someone who understood that the difference between a situation you survive and a situation you don't is usually not heroics. It's the quality of your attention in the weeks before the crisis moment arrives. The Kestrel was due for a full sensor systems review. He moved the schedule forward by 10 days. The Soreth had failed to break humanity's military position. They had partially softened its coalition structure. And they had learned, through careful observation, where the seams were. What they had not yet learned, and what they were about to discover at cost, was that humanity had been watching them watch. The crisis that everyone had been expecting arrived in a form that nobody had predicted. Not a fleet movement. Not a diplomatic breakdown. Not a probe incursion that crossed the legal threshold into actionable territory. It came as a medical evacuation request, broadcast on standard Concorde emergency frequencies, from a small Polhari research vessel that had been conducting survey operations in the outer Hellion corridor and had suffered a catastrophic life support failure with a crew of 11 aboard. The Kestrel was the nearest vessel. By 16 hours. The nearest Soreth vessel was 40 minutes away. Aotearoa received the distress signal at 0342 local ship time. He was on the bridge in 7 minutes. The navigation solution was already being plotted by Lieutenant Osei Mensah, the Kestrel's navigation officer, who had been awake for 20 minutes before Aotearoa arrived and had already run the transit time calculation 4 different ways. Best time to intercept? Aotearoa asked. 14 hours, 11 minutes at maximum sustainable drive. The Polhari vessel has approximately 17 hours of emergency life support remaining based on their reported consumption rate. Mensah paused. 3-hour margin. Close. Yes, sir. Aotearoa looked at the display showing the Soreth vessel's position. It was a light escort-class ship, small, fast, well-armed for its size. The Soreth were observing the emergency frequency. They would have received the distress signal simultaneously. Any response from the Soreth vessel to the distress call? None logged. He thought for a moment. Get me a channel to the Polhari vessel. The communication was degraded. The Polhari ship's systems were clearly struggling, but comprehensible. Their captain was a young officer named Den who was managing to keep his voice steady despite the situation, which Aotearoa noted with professional respect. Kestrel is en route, Aotearoa told him. Best transit time 14 hours. Your margin is 3 hours if your life support estimates are accurate. What's the status of your emergency reserves? Den's response confirmed the numbers. He didn't ask about the Soreth vessel. Aotearoa noted that too. The Kestrel went to maximum drive. At the same time, Aotearoa sent 3 messages. The first was to Concorde Emergency Services. Formal notification that UNSV Kestrel was responding to the Polhari distress call, with coordinates, timeline, and vessel status. Standard protocol. The second was to the Soreth vessel on the emergency channel. UNSV Kestrel is en route to assist Polhari vessel PH's Corridor 7. We are aware of your proximity. Emergency coordination procedures under Concorde Charter Section 12 are available if you are also responding. Please advise. Section 12 covered multi-vessel emergency response cooperation. It was a Concorde protocol not binding on the Soreth who were not members. But invoking it on record was important for reasons that had nothing to do with the immediate rescue. The third message was private to Okafor, flagged urgent. Sorith vessel near Polhari distress. No response to emergency channel. Proceeding to rescue. You should know. The Sorith vessel did not respond to the Section 12 offer. It also did not move toward the Polhari ship. For the first hour it held position. Then it began moving, not toward the distress call, not away from it, but on a track that would bring it to a position roughly equidistant from the Polhari vessel and the Kestrel's projected intercept point. Vasanth analyzed the track for 20 minutes before saying what everyone on the bridge was thinking. They're positioning to observe. Or to intercept us, Mensa said quietly. No, Adoora said. He studied the track again. If they were going to intercept, they'd want to be ahead of us, not alongside. They want to see what we do. Why? He didn't answer immediately. Because we're doing something they don't have a complete model of yet. What followed were 14 hours that tested the Kestrel's systems, her crew and Adoora's composure in ways that were mundane and exhausting rather than dramatic. Drive maintenance at maximum output required continuous engineering attention. The Kestrel's chief engineer, a Finnish officer named Hanel Mäkinen, ran her team in 2-hour rotations and managed to coax an additional 3% above the rated maximum from the drive system using a combination of technical knowledge and creative profanity. They arrived with 2 hours and 40 minutes to spare. The Polhari vessel was listing, its solar panels partially retracted from a microdebris impact, running on its last backup power cell. The evacuation took 94 minutes, complicated by the Polhari crew's atmospheric requirements, which required the Kestrel's medical team to set up a temporary environmental enclosure in the secondary cargo bay. All 11 crew members were transferred alive. The Sorith escort vessel remained at its observing position throughout. It never moved closer than 80,000 kilometers to either vessel. It never transmitted again. When the Polhari crew was confirmed aboard and the Kestrel began its return transit, the Sorith ship turned and withdrew toward its previous patrol area. The Polhari government's response was immediate and genuine. Their ambassador to the Concorde issued a formal statement of gratitude within 6 hours. Den, once he'd recovered enough to communicate clearly, sent a personal message to Adoora that was short and direct. You didn't have to push that hard. We know what the margin was. Thank you. Adoora replied, any crew would have done the same. He believed that. He also knew it mattered enormously that they had. Okafor's assessment, delivered in a joint briefing to the UN Security Council and UNSF High Command, was the clearest articulation of the strategic moment she had produced. What the Sorith observed today was not a military capability. It was a behavioral demonstration. They watched a human vessel accept significant risk and significant cost to assist a third-party species with whom we have a coalition relationship. They watched us treat that obligation as real. The monitoring network, the coalition building, the legal frameworks, all of it is more credible when demonstrated under conditions where not following through would have been easier. She paused. The Polhari full participation in the monitoring agreement was reinstated this morning. No conditions. No amendment. She didn't say the rest, but it was understood. The Sorith had watched the rescue and run a new calculation. And something in that calculation had shifted. The Davan made contact 3 days later. Not through the Concorde's standard diplomatic channels, through a private communication to Okafor's personal diplomatic terminal, using an encoding protocol that dated to the Concorde's founding era. The message was longer than the 3 words they'd sent before, though not dramatically so. It expressed, in the careful and layered way of Davan communication, something that amounted to an invitation. A senior Davan diplomatic figure would be willing to discuss humanity's current strategic situation with human representatives in an informal setting. Informal, in Davan terms, meant binding enough to matter, discreet enough to allow candor. The Davan were the oldest spacefaring civilization still actively present in galactic politics. They didn't extend invitations like this often. The last time they had done so with a new species, the outcome had reshaped the Concorde's security architecture for a century. Okafor accepted within the hour. The Kestrel had not fired a weapon. It had answered a distress call. But in the mathematics of galactic politics, what it had demonstrated, that humanity's commitments were real, its reach was real, and its presence in this galaxy was not provisional, had just opened a door that no military action could have opened. The oldest civilization in explored space wanted to talk. The meeting with the Davan took place in a system that didn't appear on any Concorde navigational chart available to member species below full membership tier. That was the first thing Okafor noted. The location itself was a form of communication. The Davan were telling humanity where its current standing placed it, and more importantly, that they were willing to extend a provisional trust that went somewhat beyond that standing. The Davan representative who met with Okafor and her senior delegation was identified in their formal introduction as Remembrance of Deep Consideration, a title name that the translation framework rendered accurately but that carried layers of meaning in Davan culture, suggesting someone who held significant institutional memory and spoke with authority grounded in long observation rather than recent appointment. In informal reference, the human delegation had agreed beforehand to use the shortened form. Deep. Deep was old. Not in a way that biological age alone could explain. There was a quality of settled patience about them that seemed to have more to do with the accumulated weight of things witnessed than with any individual's lifespan. The Davan had been present in interstellar space for approximately 4,000 years. They had watched species rise and fail and rise again, had observed the full arc of the Concorde's development from its foundational agreements to its current complex bureaucratic maturity, had seen 43 species navigate the transition from planetary to galactic civilization with varying degrees of success and grace. They had opinions about the process. They rarely shared them. The meeting lasted 3 days. Okafor had prepared for a conversation about the Sorath situation, tactical framing, alliance structures, the monitoring network, humanity's assessment of Sorath long-term intent. She brought briefing documents, data packages, the full diplomatic record. Deep listened to her initial presentation with the complete attention that Davan communication involved, and then, gently and without any sense of dismissal, redirected the conversation. They didn't want to talk about the Sorath specifically. They wanted to talk about what humanity had done and why, the pattern underneath the specific events, the underlying framework from which the responses had emerged. They asked questions that were, on the surface, simple but carried enormous implication. When your vessel stayed at the Sorath installation instead of withdrawing, what was the reasoning? And, the rescue, was that a calculated decision or an instinctive one? And, your coalition with smaller species, is it designed for their benefit or yours? Okafor answered honestly, which she had decided beforehand was the only strategy worth attempting with a civilization 4,000 years her senior. The installation stay had been calculated, doctrine, protocol, legal architecture applied deliberately. The rescue had been both. The instinct to go was immediate, the calculation of how to go optimally was systematic. The coalition served both parties genuinely, which was why it held under pressure where purely transactional alliances had not. Deep listened to each answer for a long time before responding. On the third day they said something that Okafor transcribed verbatim and would spend years afterward considering. We have observed many young species reach the point you have reached. Most of them at this stage have made one of 2 errors. The first is to treat the galaxy as a problem to be solved through dominance, to mistake their first successes for proof of fundamental superiority. The second is to mistake the galaxy's complexity for chaos and to conclude that principles cannot survive contact with it. Pause. You appear to be attempting a third path. It is more difficult than either of the first 2. We thought you should know that we are watching it. The practical outcomes of the 3-day meeting were not, in themselves, dramatic. The Davan did not offer a military alliance. They did not provide technological transfer. They did not make promises about future support. What they offered was access. Humanity would be provided with the coordinates of 3 Davan observation posts in the outer corridor region, staffed by Davan monitoring personnel, whose sensor data would be shared with human analysts on a regular basis. Quietly. Informally. Off the Concorde's official channel but entirely legal and consistent with Davan practice. Okafor recognized immediately what it meant. The Davan sensor technology was, by general consensus of Concorde technical analysts, significantly more capable than anything currently available to other member species. The 3 observation posts would fill every remaining gap in the monitoring network with a quality of coverage that nothing short of a substantial fleet could have replicated. The Sorath probe mapping of the Southern Corridor approach had just been made obsolete. When she communicated this to the UNSF High Command, Admiral Al-Rashid was quiet for a moment before responding. How did we get the Davan to do this? Okafor thought about the 3 days and Deep's questions and the answer that had led to this outcome. We answered their questions honestly, including the ones that didn't make us look entirely competent. Ada Ora received the summary briefing on a standard duty day, between a navigation systems review and a scheduled crew evaluation. He read it in his office, the door closed, coffee going cold on his desk. He thought about the sequence that had led from the Kestrel sitting 300,000 kilometers from a Sorath installation in the middle of the night with a crew of 190 people and a sensor log, to humanity having a quiet, informal intelligence partnership with the oldest spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy. It hadn't been a straight line. It never was. There had been the tribunal, and the fleet pressure in the corridor, and the coalition building under Sorath interference, and the information operations and the probe mapping, and the rescue that happened to occur in front of a Sorath observer vessel, and 100 smaller decisions made by people across 3 years of sustained, exhausting, careful attention to a problem that didn't have clean solutions. None of it had been inevitable. Any number of moments could have gone differently. A different commanding officer at the installation encounter who chose withdrawal over documentation. A tribunal that decided procedural caution outweighed precedent. A rescue calculation that assessed the margin as too narrow to justify maximum drive output. The long reach was not a weapon. It was a practice. The decision, made and remade daily, to operate as if principles had weight, as if the record mattered, as if how you treated smaller allies in moments of genuine cost was more strategically significant than how you positioned forces in moments of direct confrontation. He wrote in his log, "We are a young species in a very old galaxy. We don't have 4,000 years of accumulated wisdom. We don't have 400 warships. What we have, if we're careful with it, is a reputation we're still building. The decisions that built it weren't dramatic. They were just consistent. The Sorath Dominion did not dissolve, did not collapse, did not suddenly become cooperative. They were what they had been, methodical, patient, committed to expansion on their own terms. But the calculus that governed their expansion decisions had been permanently altered. The human zone of influence now sat within a monitoring architecture that included 5 allied species and informal Davan sensor coverage. Any move against human-registered space would be observed from the moment it began by multiple parties, with records that would survive the outcome. The Concord precedent established by the tribunal meant that any Sorath violation would energize the retrospective claims of a dozen other species. The rescue of the Pulhari crew had demonstrated that human commitments to coalition partners were not abstract. They were operational even at real cost. The calculation did not favor them. Not currently. Not for the foreseeable future, given the trajectory of human fleet development, coalition depth and legal standing. They adapted as they always did. Shifted their expansion vectors further south. Found other frontiers with less complicated opposition calculus. The galaxy was large. The Sorath would continue to be a long-term concern. But they moved their primary focus elsewhere. 5 years after the Kestrel first encountered that installation in the dark, Ada Ora gave a lecture at the UNSF Academy on Luna. The cadets were young, the generation that would take the fleet into its next phase, when the numbers were larger and the standing was more established. He talked about the sensor log. About Protocol 7 and why it was 47 pages long. About the rescue and the 3-hour margin and what it had cost the engineering team and why it had mattered far beyond the 11 lives saved. About the Davan meeting and what it said about how the galaxy actually worked, beneath the surface of fleet movements and legal proceedings. At the end, a cadet asked the question they usually asked. Did you think, when you stayed at that installation instead of withdrawing, that it would lead to all of this? He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. No, he said. I thought it was the right decision for that moment, for the reasons that applied in that moment. That was enough. Pause. It's usually enough. If you're consistent about it. Somewhere in the deep corridor, 3 Davan observation posts hummed quietly in the dark, their sensors sweeping the approaches to human space with the patient thoroughness of a civilization that had been watching the galaxy for 4,000 years. And now watching it in this small corner, alongside humanity. The galaxy had made an assumption about the young species from the single inhabited world on the arm of an unremarkable spiral galaxy. It had updated that assumption. Carefully. Precisely. As it should. The Kestrel was decommissioned in 2071 after 14 years of service. Her sensor logs from the initial corridor incident are held in the Concord's permanent legal archive, the first human documents to be granted that status. Commander Yusuf Ada Ora retired from active service in 2073. His final captain's log entry read, "We came to this galaxy late and small. We leave it, not yet, not for a long time, but eventually, as something the galaxy will remember having taken seriously. That's not a small thing." It wasn't.